Condemnation from across the world after Israel twice attacked United Nations peacekeepers in Lebanon. The multi-nation UNIFIL force has been in southern Lebanon since 1978. So why is Israel targeting the mission, and can it remain in place? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Folly Thibault. Israel's attacks on the UN Peacekeeping mission headquarters in southern Lebanon have been condemned across the world. The spectrum of anger reflects the multinational nature of the UNIFIL mission, more than 10,000 troops from 50 countries. Senior military officers say Israel's attacks were deliberate, just days after its ground forces crossed the border into southern Lebanon and after huge bomb attacks in Beirut targeting senior Hezbollah figures but killing many civilians. While at the same time, Israel's genocide in Gaza continues and the world waits for an Israeli attack on Iran in response to missile strikes from there earlier this month. So why is Israel now attacking UNIFIL? What can the UN do about it? And is the mission's future now at risk? We'll put that to our guests shortly, but first this report from Barbara.
An attack by a UN member state on UN peacekeepers. Troops were injured after Israeli forces fired at the headquarters of the peacekeeping mission in southern Lebanon, twice in 2 days. Nations contributing to UNIFIL condemned Israel's attacks, calling them deliberate and a war crime.
It is unacceptable. It violates what was established by Resolution 1701 of the United Nations. The Italian government, as you know, has strongly protested with the Israeli authorities.
It is therefore totally unacceptable to see UNIFIL troops deliberately targeted by the Israeli armed forces. We condemn it, we will not tolerate it, and will not tolerate it happening again.
Israeli attacks destroyed surveillance equipment, hampering UNIFIL's ability to monitor fighting near the Lebanese-Israeli border.
The shots hit some vehicles, and the fuel tanks located inside the base rendered the surveillance system's optical cameras inoperative. The installation was then flown over for a long time by an Israeli army drone.
Israel says it's targeting the Lebanese armed group Hezbollah's commanders and infrastructure. Those fearing that the strikes on the UN peacekeeping mission are in preparation for a long-term occupation of Lebanon will get little comfort from messages from Washington, Israel's primary backer and arms supplier.
What I can tell you is we're watching this very closely. We support their ability to target militants, to degrade Hezbollah's infrastructure, to degrade Hezbollah's capability. But we are very cognizant of the many times in the past where Israel has gone in on what looked like limited operations and has stayed for months or for years.
The scale of Israel's last invasion of Lebanon in 2006 is overshadowed by the intensity of the violence this time.
And if you think that the conflict in 2006, 1,200 people were killed, and only in a few days more than the conflict in 2006. So this is incredibly serious. We are not only urging the parties, but it's also important for the international community to see it as a priority and that there is no military solution. The only solution is political and diplomatic.
For now, UNIFIL peacekeepers are refusing to abandon their posts. Lebanon's army is trying to assert some control while the fighting between Israel and Hezbollah escalates with little prospect of a ceasefire. Barbara Ngopa, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Well, the UN Interim Force in Lebanon, or UNIFIL, was created in 1978 to oversee the withdrawal of Israeli forces from Lebanon. That's after Palestinian fighters entered Israel by sea from Lebanon, sparking what became known as the South Lebanon conflict. UNIFIL has about 10,000 soldiers from 50 countries along the border with Israel, known as the Blue Line. Its mandate was expanded in 2006 after the 34-day war between Israel and Hezbollah. It now monitors the cessation of hostilities and supports Lebanon's army across the south. The peacekeeping mission is based in Khouri, where the Israeli military fired at UNIFIL forces. Well, let's bring in our guests now for today's show. In Beirut, Ali Rizk, a political and security affairs analyst. In Boston, we have Rami Khouri, distinguished public policy fellow at the American University of Beirut. And in Galway Island, Raymond Murphy, professor with the Irish Centre for Human Rights at the University of Galway and a former UN peacekeeper with UNIFIL in Lebanon. A warm welcome to you all, gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining us today. Ray Murphy, let me start with you because UNIFIL is a mission you know well, having served in it. Israel says it was targeting what it describes as a threat when it fired at UNIFIL's headquarters at Khouri. From a military perspective, was this an accidental act or a deliberate targeting of UN peacekeepers in southern Lebanon?
I think the only reasonable conclusion that you can draw is that this was a deliberate attack on the UN post. The Khouri headquarters has been there since 1978. It's a very large UN military installation. There is no way that you could interpret the observation post as posing any type of threat to Hezbollah or the Israeli Defense Forces. And therefore, the attack on the Khouri observation post was very sinister and marked a very significant escalation in the tensions that have existed between the Israeli forces and UNIFIL, not just now, but since the incursion began. And, I would say to, the viewers, all UN posts are highly visible. They're not normal military posts in a conflict zone that seek to conceal their location and are with significant ramparts or defensive positions. They are very vulnerable because they have to be visible. That is their primary role, to be seen to be carrying out the mandate on behalf of the UN Security Council and on the international community. And also, they are peacekeepers. So therefore, they are protected persons under international humanitarian law. Their role is not a combat role. It was never intended to be a combat role. And, it's something akin to being an armed police officer in a situation of significant tension or violence. But in no circumstances is it lawful or correct to target peacekeepers who are trying to carry out what is essentially an impossible mandate, not just in the current circumstances.
Yeah, and I'll ask you more about this mandate and mission, Ray, in just a few minutes and what it's been able to achieve. But let me bring in Ali into the conversation and get your initial thoughts, Ali. Israel alleges that Hezbollah has been operating on the vicinity of the UNIFIL outposts in Khouri in southern Lebanon, and that the UN peacekeeping mission there didn't do anything to prevent Israeli attacks, as stated by Resolution 1701. And that therefore they had to take matters into their own hands. There have been exchanges of fire in the past. How serious an escalation do you think this is? And was this, same question I put to Ray, was this a deliberate attack, you think?
Well, the UNIFIL itself said it was a deliberate attack. I spoke to a UNIFIL official today, and he told me that it was clearly a deliberate attack which was carried out by the Israeli side. And as you alluded to in your question, the Israelis view the UNIFIL in a somewhat hostile way. They think the UNIFIL isn't doing its job when it comes to Hezbollah's weapons or preventing Hezbollah from having an armed presence in the area of operations. Although, as the previous guest said, UNIFIL's job and mandate does not include any enforcing mechanism. It is there to support the Lebanese army in carrying out its duty and in ensuring both sides commit to Resolution 1701, and UNIFIL also takes down or records the violations which are committed by both sides. So, as I said, the Israelis, they do have a hostile stance when it comes to UNIFIL. For quite a long time, they've been demanding a change of UNIFIL's mandate. They want it to be under Chapter 7, which would grant UNIFIL the power or the authority to use force. And I think it stems from here. There is a state of dissatisfaction on the part of Israel regarding UNIFIL, and this is being translated now in the actions they have taken. This is unprecedented, however, 2 days in a row, targeting UNIFIL posts, targeting UNIFIL soldiers. Unfortunately, the injuries have been light injuries, but Israel has taken its hostility towards UNIFIL, I think, to new heights. And I think this is part of a broader Israeli approach, if we would like, of hostility towards the UN organization in general, which we've seen very clearly in the policies and in the rhetoric used by the Netanyahu government.
Right. Rami, your thoughts about this? Even the French have said that this was a deliberate attack on UN peacekeepers, that Israel was sending a message. Just how significant an incident is this in the unfolding war in Lebanon? And what does it suggest about Israel's strategy and the way they're prepared to wage this war in Lebanon?
Israel for years has been critical of the UN and the role the UN plays in the Arab-Israeli conflict, or the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, or Lebanese-Israeli. You can see this in Israel's attitude, say, to UNRWA and other UN activities, that it really doesn't want to continue because it thinks that this is a way to keep alive the Palestinian issue and the Palestinian demand for their national rights. In the case of UNIFIL, the Israelis have never seen UNIFIL as a really serious operation that can enforce the peace or maintain the peace. UNIFIL is an observation force more than anything else. It reports violations that it sees. But the Israelis have done this before. They've attacked UN schools. They've attacked medical services. Now they've attacked UNIFIL, and they've attacked UNIFIL before. So this is no surprise. And the Prime Minister Netanyahu at the UN General Assembly a while ago called the UN a cesspool. I can't remember the exact quote, a cesspool of vipers, I think, or something like that. Just terrible. They're right out in the open. They don't want international law. And everything they've done in Gaza and Lebanon in the last year has basically shredded international law and UN resolutions and humanitarian protections in the same way that their American and British and German and other weapons have shredded babies and women in their sleep. And they don't care about international law. All they want is their supremacy in the region, and this is their way of showing it.
Right. Ray Murphy, Israel said they gave advance warning, and they say they asked UNIFIL to redeploy temporarily from some of their positions, to move back basically from those positions. But UNIFIL say they refuse to do this because, you know, this is exactly what their mandate is on the ground, to observe what's happening along that blue line. Can you tell us more about the mandate of this mission and how it's evolved since 1978 and then 2006, of course, we saw a change in the mandate. Just how challenging has it been for UNIFIL to fulfill this mandate on the ground in southern Lebanon?
Yeah, the change in the mandate in 2006 was very substantial. The mandate 1701 is completely different from Resolution 425 that was adopted in 1978. And one of the major problems with the current mandate is that it straddles traditional peacekeeping and peace enforcement. It does not refer to Chapter 7, so it's clearly not a Chapter 7 authorized mission. But the expectation, especially from the Israelis and the Americans, was to push UNIFIL to do the job that actually Israel failed to do in 2006, as in essentially oversee the disarmament and the disarmament of Hezbollah in the south and the demilitarization of that area. And it was never a possibility that a UN force of the nature of UNIFIL, that it could undertake a task of that nature and be successful. And within the Security Council, it's interesting that this year there's been a unanimous adoption of the resolution reapproving 1701. But last year in 2023, the Chinese and the Russians abstained because one of the tensions that existed prior to the current incursion was UNIFIL's freedom of movement. UNIFIL is there to support the Lebanese armed forces. Now, the Lebanese armed forces are significantly weak. In fact, the Lebanese government barely exists. And of course, that is partially as a consequence of Israeli policies towards Lebanon over many decades. But it's very important for a UN mission to have freedom of movement in its designated area of operations. But Hezbollah consistently sought to restrict that.
Let me ask you, Ray, briefly on that, because I think it's important for our viewers to know this. UNIFIL has a limited mandate, but do they have Can they use lethal force to protect themselves, as we've seen in these recent incidents? Could we see UNIFIL use lethal force against the Israeli army if they deemed to be under threat?
Yeah, well, I'd like to distinguish here in answering that the difference between the technical legal answer in terms of what's on paper and the reality on the ground. According to every UN mandate, UN forces have a right to resort to the use of deadly force to defend themselves and to defend the mandate. But I stress that all UN peacekeeping forces rely on the cooperation of parties. Now, the idea that UNIFIL, which is lightly armed, multinational force with relatively weak command and control systems, etc., but no combat support or no heavy weapons, the idea that it could take on the Israeli Defense Forces would be ludicrous and would be suicidal. There's no prospect whatsoever of UNIFIL being able to make any real military resistance to Israeli encroachments or Israeli use of force against UN positions. As I said, as a last resort, it may use force to defend itself. And there is another technical but very important legal implications for this, because if UNIFIL began to take on Hezbollah or began to take on militarily the Israeli Defense Forces, then UNIFIL troops would lose their protected status because they would become combatants and parties to the conflict, something which none of the contributing states would support and is not the purpose of UNIFIL on the ground.
Very interesting. I think it was important to clarify that. Thank you for that, Ray. Ali, your thoughts about what Ray just said there, and you know, being in Lebanon, what do you think UNIFIL has been able to achieve on the ground in southern Lebanon? And do you think that still today they're able to fulfill their mandate under the current form, or should there be changes to this mission and the mandate?
Well, I think that UNIFIL's role is beneficial. For example, it hosts the tripartite meeting, the meeting which is held occasionally between the Lebanese military, the Israeli military, mediated by UNIFIL. So that is a useful role which is played in that regard, because, as you know, there are no official ties between Lebanon and Israel, and so there's no communication. That hence does facilitate. And I think another very important role for UNIFIL is the recording of the violations of Resolution 1701. As has been mentioned, UNIFIL plays a role. It observes and it takes down the violations of both sides, be it the Israeli side or the Lebanese side. I do have a comment about the enforcement mechanism. I think it's important to know that Hezbollah would never have agreed to the UNIFIL being able to enforce anything. One of the conditions for Hezbollah to approve a UNIFIL mission was that there would not be any enforcement mechanism. So I think that's something important to bear in mind. And another important point, I think, to mention is that the countries that make up UNIFIL, France, Italy, Spain, Indonesia, all of these countries, to some extent, have acceptable ties. They don't recognize Hezbollah as being a terrorist organization. So when Hezbollah agreed to all of these arrangements in 2006, I think it had all of these factors in mind. Regarding the violations, I did hear your previous guest say that Hezbollah was somehow restricting the movement of UNIFIL. I'm not aware of any of these cases. From what I know, it's possible. I'm not sure. But I think most important of all is that you have almost daily Israeli violations of Lebanese sovereignty. So I think that the bigger violator of this resolution, of Resolution 1701, is coming from the Israeli side. And the fact, just one last point, the fact that the Israelis are shooting now deliberately at UNIFIL forces, it means they don't want this UNIFIL presence to be there. Now, why is that? Why don't they want the eyes and ears of the international community to be in that area of operations? I think that raises a lot of suspicions as to what Israel is planning for.
Let me ask Rami about that, the political ramifications of this and what the international community might do next. We've heard a firm message coming from European leaders, from France and Spain notably, which is calling for a total arms embargo on Israel. Will a European embargo make a difference, a substantial difference, you think?
If a European or any major embargo of arms sales to Israel were to happen, it would definitely make a difference. But the chances of that happening are pretty close to me going to the moon for a picnic. It's not realistic given the reality of the politics of most of the Europeans, with a few exceptions, like the Irish and the Spanish and others, and the United States. So this is a problem. The UNIFIL for Israel is a symbol of the international community's quest for the implementation of international law and justice for all parties concerned. The UNIFIL also is, in South Lebanon, when you go to South Lebanon, you see relatively cordial relations between UNIFIL and the local communities. UNIFIL goes out of its way to carry out social development projects, help provide villages with wells, or things like, symbolic things, but a gesture of human interaction, which the Lebanese like. And the Lebanese and all the Arabs have always looked to the UN as a force of ultimate protection, a source of ultimate protection. So there were cases when, during the Lebanese-Israeli wars or Hezbollah-Israeli wars, the Lebanese would go into a UN facility, and there was one in Kana in South Lebanon some years ago where the Israelis bombed it, the UN facility the Lebanese were sheltering. So this is a dilemma on a wider scale, that the UN is seen positively by Lebanese and Arabs, but mostly negatively by Israelis. So it's a reflection of the stalemate that we have and the Israeli insistence on the massive use of force.
Rami, we talked about the European reaction. What about the Americans, the US reaction? They appear to be criticizing Israel about their actions, but only off the record.
Well, off the record or on the record, I mean, what the Americans say is often reasonable, but what they do is consistently unreasonable in relation to how they deal with the Israelis and how they deal with Palestinians and Lebanese. The Americans are very committed to what Israel is doing. They defend it all the time, and they say, "Oh, but they should be careful not to kill civilians," which is silly. Nobody takes the Americans seriously when they say these things. So we'll have to see if the elections coming up in the U.S. Have some kind of impact. If enough people don't vote for Kamala Harris because of her position on Gaza, that might be a message to the political elite that you better start paying attention to the sentiments of Americans on how U.S. power is used around the world. The chances of that are slim, but not zero. Right. So really what you need is a more powerful multinational consensus at the UN otherwise.
All right. Ray Murphy, where do you see this heading? I mean, will UNIFIL be eventually forced to leave southern Lebanon if the situation further deteriorates?
I certainly hope not, because, all right, I accept that it cannot fulfill its mandate now. In fact, I don't think it could ever fully implement the mandate that it was given, but it was still playing a significant role in South Lebanon. And the very fact that the Israelis are adopting these tactics, which I believe are intended to drive UNIFIL out in the hope or expectation that it might withdraw, is enough reason for me to support its continued presence. But for many years after the 1982 invasion, Israeli and UN forces were side by side in South Lebanon in what was very difficult and trying circumstances. And UNIFIL did its best to ensure that Israel complied with international human rights law, international humanitarian law, and continued to report from the ground on what was happening during that particular occupation. Mm-hmm. So I think the fact, as alluded to by previous speakers, the fact that there is an international presence, which is the eyes and ears of the international community, we can get objective reports of what is actually happening on the ground.
Right.
And the very presence of 10,000 international peacekeepers restricts the freedom of Israeli forces to do whatever it wishes in South Lebanon.
But what should the international community, Ray? What should the international community and the United Nations, the Security Council, be doing right now today to ensure that there is a continued presence of UN peacekeepers on the ground in southern Lebanon?
Well, the peacekeepers are in a very precarious situation in terms of their force protection or personal safety. So it's imperative that the Security Council act cohesively and together to support what is their peacekeeping force on the ground, and that the United States and the other permanent members and the non-permanent members and their allies put pressure on Israel to comply with Resolution 1701 and international law, and to respect the role of the UN peacekeepers, and to defend their right to be there and ensure that they are not subject to deliberate attack.
All right, Ali, your thoughts. How do you see the situation evolving? Could Israeli attacks force this UN peacekeeping mission to leave southern Lebanon? And what do you think the UN and the international community as a whole should be doing to amplify their mandate and ensure that they're more effective on the ground?
I don't think that these latest developments are going to force UNIFIL to withdraw from the area of operations. If any indication, what we've seen from UNIFIL up until now is more insistence on staying there in order to fulfill the mandate. So no, I don't. It's true that UNIFIL is not implementing its mandate to the full. And by the way, both sides, when I say both sides, I mean Hezbollah and Israel, they accuse UNIFIL of not doing enough when it comes to completely implementing Resolution 1701. But I think that UNIFIL's presence, nevertheless, is beneficial, as was mentioned now just by the previous guest. It is a neutral party which can record the violations, show which side is more committed and which side is less committed to this resolution. But I think that any dramatic changes are going to be extremely difficult. Hezbollah, the Lebanese government, more importantly, I don't think they're going to accept a Chapter 7, the troops being there in accordance with Chapter 7. So I think for the time being, we're not going to see any real changes in UNIFIL's mandate.
Okay, Rami, Khouri, you have the last word. What's the future for the UN peacekeeping mission in southern Lebanon? How can it be more effective?
The future for the UN and UNIFIL and all UN agencies in the region is the same as other cases. It's to gather an international consensus on the importance of implementing international law or international conventions and treaties and things effectively but equitably across the board to protect Israel from being attacked, to protect Lebanon from being attacked. This is what has to be done, but they've tried to do this, and it's very difficult when you have a power like Israel, which is extremely strong, has massive Western support, and doesn't give a hoot for international law or UN resolutions. So it's not an easy task, but it's become much more imperative. And I don't think anybody has the answer other than a multinational political campaign to end the Arab-Israeli conflict through negotiations that satisfy the rights and demands of both sides, which I believe can be done, or all sides, because you've got Palestinians, Lebanese, Syrians, Israelis. It can be done, but nobody has tried to do it in the same way that, for instance, pressure was brought on South Africa. And Israel is moving in the direction of apartheid South Africa. One option, by the way, would be to suspend Israel from the UN, but that's not going to happen.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for a fascinating discussion. Thank you for your insights. Ray Murphy, Ali Risk, Rami Khouri, thank you for joining us. And thank you too for watching. You can always watch this program again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And of course, you can join the conversation on X. Our handle is at AJ Inside Story. From me, Folly, Thibault, and the whole team here in Doha, thanks for watching. Bye for now. Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.